I never thought I'd stand at the edge of that cliff again, not after what happened, not after the moment my life had almost ended in a single push, the day I thought he had killed me. I remember the sound of my husband's voice, low and sharp, arguing with me, the way the wind had whipped against the mountain that afternoon, carrying everything up and away. One second, I was on solid ground, yelling, pleading, trying to reason with him, and the next, I was falling, tumbling, the ground rushing up to meet me in a blur of jagged rocks and loose dirt. Every second stretched into eternity, my body twisting, my arms flailing, my heart hammering, and then, nothing. Darkness, cold, silence. I woke up hours later, not knowing if it was a dream or if I had really survived. Somehow, miraculously, I had landed in a cluster of shrubs that broke my fall enough to leave me alive. My legs were bruised, my ribs ached, and every inch of me hurt like I had been ground into the dirt. But I was alive, and alive meant something. Someone had to pay for what he did. My mind went through the motions: panic, shock, disbelief, rage. I couldn't let him get away with it. Not after that. Not after everything. I crawled down the slope, every movement agonizing, my fingers clawing into the dirt and roots, trying to get my bearings. The air was sharp, cold, filled with that metallic smell of scraped skin and broken branches. I could hear the distant hum of cars from the mountain road above, but I couldn't risk being seen. Not yet. I needed to disappear, to think, to figure out my next move without him knowing I had survived. Every step was a reminder that I had been betrayed in the most violent way imaginable, that someone I trusted with my life, the person who was supposed to protect me, had tried to kill me. When I finally made it to the bottom, the world felt different. Everything was sharper, brighter, crueler. I limped through the forest, my hands scraping against tree bark, my clothes torn, my body shaking from adrenaline and fear. The sun was setting behind the peaks, casting long shadows that twisted across the ground, and I felt like I was moving through a world that had suddenly grown monstrous, a place where nothing was safe and everything could hurt me. I found a stream, kneeled and drank greedily, ignoring the mud and leaves in the water. I splashed my face, trying to wash off the dirt, the blood, the fear. I had to be ready. I had to survive. That night, I slept in a small hollow under a tree, wrapped in my jacket, trembling, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every branch that cracked, every animal that moved, made my heart leap into my throat. I couldn't believe this was my life now. I couldn't believe I had been pushed, betrayed, and left for dead. I kept thinking about his face, the cold, cruel look in his eyes, the moment he made a decision to end me. Rage consumed me. Hatred burned through me.
But underneath it all, there was a deeper, gnawing fear. What had he planned next? What else could he do if I was still alive? The next morning, I forced myself to move. My legs screamed with pain, but the fear, the anger, the drive to survive pushed me forward. I knew I couldn't go back home. Not yet. Not while he thought I was dead. He would be waiting for me, pretending, lying, smiling that false smile of a man who thought he could control everything. I needed evidence. I needed proof. I needed a plan. Every step I took down the mountain road was calculated, careful, as if the world itself might try to stop me. And maybe it would. Maybe it would. But I had no choice. I made it to the town below the mountain by nightfall. My body was a mess of cuts and bruises, my clothes ripped and stained with dirt, blood, and sweat. I avoided the main streets, sticking to shadows, ducking into alleyways when people passed. I couldn't risk being recognized. Not yet. If anyone told him I was alive, it would end badly. But I had to find a way to survive, to get my bearings, and figure out my next move. I found a small motel on the outskirts, one that looked like it hadn't seen visitors in months. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting a pale glow across the empty parking lot. I checked in under a fake name, leaving a deposit and avoiding eye contact with the clerk. The room smelled of mildew and old carpet, but it was safe. For now. I collapsed onto the bed, tears streaming down my face. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about how easily he had decided I wasn't worth saving, how easily he had thought my life meant nothing. And I couldn't stop thinking about what I would do next. I had to stay alive. I had to protect myself. I had to make sure he paid. But how? I barely knew where to start. He was careful, manipulative, smart. That's why he had gotten away with it once, but I couldn't let him get away with it again. I closed my eyes, trying to block out everything, but his face haunted me, etched into my mind, sharp and cruel. I promised myself I wouldn't forget. I wouldn't forgive. The following days were a blur of survival. I found food, clean clothes, and slowly began to gather the pieces of my old life. Identification, credit cards, anything I could use. I stayed in motels, moved quietly, avoided anyone who might know me, anyone who could alert him. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped, terrified it was him, tracking me, watching me, waiting. I couldn't go to the police. Not yet. Not without proof. Not without a plan. He was dangerous, and I had to be smarter than him. I had to be faster. Then, one evening, I stumbled upon it. A clue, something that made my blood run cold, but also gave me a thread to hold on to. In the small town library, searching through public records and online news articles, I found a report about a missing woman and her husband. The description of the husband matched him perfectly. Tall, clean-cut, charming.
The articles were old, but the details were striking. People had complained about him before. There had been rumors of threats, intimidation, control, but nothing official, nothing legal. And now, after everything I had survived, it all clicked into place. He wasn't just violent. He was manipulative, calculating, capable of hiding his crimes, hiding his intentions, and almost getting away with murder. That night, in the dim light of the motel room, I plotted. I wrote down everything I knew, every detail about the fall, every scar he had left, every sign he had shown of who he really was. I realized that surviving wasn't enough. I needed evidence. I needed proof. And I needed to confront him, not just for revenge, but to protect myself, to stop him from ever hurting anyone else. Every plan I made was measured, cautious, realistic. I couldn't let anger blind me. I had to be smart. By the time the week had passed since I had been pushed, I was ready. I had a plan, a way to gather proof, a way to make sure he couldn't manipulate the story anymore. I returned to the mountain, under the cover of night, to the exact spot where he had pushed me. Standing there, looking down the cliff, I remembered every second, every sensation, every terror-filled heartbeat. And I realized something that made my blood run cold. Surviving wasn't just luck. It had been a choice, a decision to live, to fight, to reclaim what he had tried to take. And now I was going to do just that. I returned home cautiously. The town was quiet, unsuspecting. He was probably at the house, thinking I was gone forever, thinking he had won. But he didn't know the truth. He didn't know that I had survived. He didn't know that I had seen everything, felt everything, and remembered everything. And he certainly didn't know that I wasn't the same person he thought he could control. I walked through the front door, careful, silent, and I froze. There he was, sitting in the living room like nothing had happened, the same smug expression, the same false charm. But now I wasn't afraid, not really, because I had the advantage he didn't even suspect. I had proof. I had preparation. I had the clarity that only someone who had stared death in the face and survived could possess. I watched him, every twitch of his face, every movement, every subtle shift in posture, and I realized how fragile his control had been, how fragile he himself was. The realization gave me strength. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just waited, letting him settle into the illusion that nothing had changed, that I was still the frightened, obedient person he had known. And then I made my move. The look on his face when he realized I had survived was worth every second of fear, every bruise, every sleepless night. He didn't expect me. He didn't expect me to be alive, prepared, unstoppable. I didn't scream, didn't shout. I didn't need to. My presence, my calm, my steady control over the room said everything he needed to hear. And in that moment, I knew I had won. I had survived. And the truth he had tried to bury, the truth he had thought would end me, was finally mine to control. The next morning, I woke up in that same motel room with a pounding headache and a stomach full of nerves. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see his face, the smug grin, the glint of something cruel behind his eyes as he shoved me over the cliff. I couldn't get it out of my head, and that image had been looping in my brain all night. I knew I had survived, and that should have been enough, but it wasn't. The adrenaline had faded, leaving me raw, scared, and more aware than ever that he could still find me. That thought made my skin crawl. I packed my things quickly, moving quietly, trying not to draw any attention to myself. I couldn't risk him knowing where I was. Every sound outside the motel, the creak of the sign, the distant roar of a passing car, felt like a potential threat. I kept checking my phone, afraid that even the slightest notification could be traced. I had no way of knowing if he had trackers, if he had spies, or if he was just out there, somewhere, waiting. My parents would have known what to do in a situation like this, but I didn't have them. I had only my instincts, my fear, and the determination not to die that day, not to let him win. I needed a plan. I needed food, supplies, and a way to start piecing together what had really happened. I had to think like him, try to anticipate every move he could make. I couldn't let my emotions control me, not yet. Every time I imagined him smiling that cruel smile, I felt the fire of anger rise in me, but I forced it down. I needed clarity. Survival wasn't about rage, it was about strategy, and that meant I had to get back to the world I had left behind and gather evidence, even if it meant risking being seen. I moved cautiously through the small town at night, sticking to shadows and alleyways, avoiding any lights or cameras I thought might track me. My legs were still sore from the fall, every step a reminder of how close I had come to death. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I kept thinking about how easily it could have ended, how easily he could have killed me and disappeared, leaving the world believing I'd fallen off the cliff by accident. And the thought made my blood run cold. He wasn't just violent, he was smart, calculated, dangerous. By the time I reached the outskirts of the town, I had made a decision. I needed to know everything I could about him, who he really was, what he had done before, and what he might do next. I couldn't rely on police reports. They wouldn't believe the story without proof. And even if they did, he was careful. He had covered his tracks. That left me with the only tools I had, my wits, my memory, and my determination to survive. I started asking around discreetly, listening, observing, piecing together the puzzle of the man I had married.
Every detail I uncovered made my stomach tighten. Every story I heard added to the portrait of someone I barely recognized as the man I thought I knew. At a small cafe on the edge of town, I overheard something that made me freeze. Two men at a corner table were talking about a disappearance that had never made it to the news, a woman who had vanished under suspicious circumstances. They described her husband, tall, clean-cut, charismatic, but with a temper that was whispered about in private. I felt my chest tighten. The description matched him perfectly. My mind raced. This wasn't just about me. This wasn't just about the fall. He had a history, a pattern, and if I wasn't careful, I could be next. I left the cafe quickly, blending into the shadows as my thoughts spiraled. Every step I took, every decision I made was calculated. I couldn't let panic dictate my actions. I couldn't give him any chance to predict my next move. I needed information, proof, a way to hold on to control in a situation that had spiraled entirely out of my hands. I realized that surviving the fall wasn't enough. I had to be proactive. I had to stay one step ahead. That night, I found an abandoned storage unit that I could use as a temporary hideout. It smelled of dust and old wood, and the floor was cold and hard, but it was safe. I spread out the few belongings I had salvaged, carefully going over the plan I was forming in my head. I needed to confront him, to uncover the truth, but I couldn't do it blindly. I needed leverage, evidence, proof that he had tried to kill me, and I needed a way to make sure he couldn't manipulate the narrative, couldn't hide behind charm and lies. Days passed, and I stayed off the grid, moving quietly, learning about him, tracking his habits from a distance. I learned the routes he took, the people he interacted with, the small patterns that gave him away. I even started leaving small clues, testing if he noticed, seeing how observant he was. It was terrifying, exhausting, and exhilarating all at once. I was living in a heightened reality where every second counted, where every misstep could be fatal. But with each discovery, with each piece of information, I felt more empowered. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was becoming someone capable of outsmarting him. Late one evening, I managed to sneak close to his apartment. From a distance, I watched him move through the familiar motions of his life, dressed, calm, oblivious to the fact that I had survived, that I knew. The sight made my blood boil. He had thought he had won. He had thought he could erase me, remove me from existence, and carry on as if nothing had happened. But I was still here, alive, watching, waiting, and for the first time since the fall, I felt the power shift. I wasn't powerless. I had control, and I knew it. That night, I went over my plan repeatedly. I would confront him, yes, but not blindly. I would have evidence, leverage, witnesses if necessary.
I would ensure that there was no question of the truth, and I would do it on my terms, in a way that left him exposed and unable to manipulate the story. The fear that had gripped me since the fall was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into focus, precision, and determination. I knew exactly what I had to do. By the time the sun rose, I had prepared myself for the confrontation. I knew his routines, his habits, the weak spots in his carefully constructed life. I had gathered proof of his intentions, his manipulations, his history. And most importantly, I knew I was alive, unbroken, and ready. Standing in the shadows outside his apartment, watching him move through the motions of his life, I felt a calm settle over me. For the first time in a week, I felt a strange sense of clarity. The cliff, the fall, the pain, it had all led me to this moment. And now it was time to act. I waited until nightfall, crouched in the shadows across from his apartment, watching every movement, memorizing every detail. He moved through the space like he always did, confident, calm, completely unaware that I had survived, completely unaware that I had been planning this exact moment for days. My chest thumped so hard I thought he might hear it through the walls, my hands trembling, not with fear, but with the cold fire of anger and determination. The man who had tried to kill me didn't even know I was alive, and that gave me a dangerous edge, a weapon I could use against him. I spent hours observing him, noting when he locked the doors, the times he left for work, the patterns in his calls and texts. Every habit, every idiosyncrasy I had learned in the months we had been together now became a tool. I realized with a sinking thrill that I knew him better than he knew me now. I knew what he expected, what he feared, and what he thought he could control. I had spent a week rebuilding myself from the ashes of that fall, preparing, planning, and learning, and now it was all coming together. I was no longer the terrified wife he had shoved off the cliff. I was someone else entirely, someone sharp, careful, and unstoppable. I slipped inside his apartment one night while he was at a dinner party with colleagues, a calculated risk that I had spent hours planning. Every movement was silent, precise, deliberate. I moved through the familiar space, the apartment that had once been our home, and everything felt like a weapon. A knife, a paperweight, a carefully placed photograph, but I didn't need any of it. I had information. I had proof. I had the knowledge that he had tried to end my life and had underestimated me entirely. My pulse raced as I rifled through his office, pulling folders, reading emails, scanning receipts. The man who had thought he could control the narrative had left himself completely exposed, and I found the evidence to prove it. There were emails, threatening messages, a record of strange purchases, and even a couple of old witness statements he had tried to bury. I photocopied everything I could carry, organizing it meticulously in a folder I had brought with me. Each piece of evidence made my stomach twist, each revelation a dagger to the sense of betrayal I had lived with for a week. But beneath it all, there was a sense of empowerment. I had survived, yes, but now I had the proof that I could confront him, and the world would see him for what he really was. I was no longer a victim. I was a force he hadn't anticipated. The first time I confronted him after gathering the evidence, it was late at night. I waited until he returned from the party, slipping back into the apartment with a key I had copied months ago. He didn't notice me at first, preoccupied, relaxed, assuming I was still gone, assuming I had been erased from his life. I watched him for a long minute, drinking in the realization that the smug, confident man who had thought he could push me off a cliff now had no idea what was coming. I felt a cold thrill in my veins, a clarity I hadn't had since the fall. This was my moment. The long week of fear, pain, and planning had brought me here, and I wasn't going to waste it. I stepped into the living room, letting the click of the door echo just enough to grab his attention. He froze, eyes widening as he turned to see me standing there, bruised, torn, but alive. For a split second, I saw something I hadn't expected: shock, fear, and the first hint of doubt in his eyes. That moment of hesitation told me everything I needed to know. The man who had tried to kill me now realized that I was a threat he couldn't control. I held the folder of evidence tightly against my chest, letting him see it without saying a word. His eyes darted to it, and I could see the calculation begin. He was trying to figure out how much I knew, how dangerous I had become. "What? How?" he started, stammering, the words catching in his throat. He tried to take a step toward me, but I moved back just enough to keep him at bay, letting the weight of the folder and my presence fill the room with authority. I could see him grappling with the reality that the woman he had shoved off a cliff was not only alive, but organized, prepared, and ready to fight back. I felt my heart hammering, but it was no longer pure fear. It was anticipation, and I let it feel me. I let it remind me that he had underestimated me from the start. I laid the folder on the coffee table, flipping it open just enough so that the evidence spilled into view. Emails, threats, receipts, everything pointed directly to him. His hands twitched, and for a moment I thought he might try to grab it, but I had anticipated that. I had memorized the layout of the apartment, every escape route, every object that could be used as leverage. I didn't have to move. I just had to exist in that space as proof, as a living embodiment of his failure.
The shock on his face was palpable. The man who had tried to erase me from existence now had to face the consequences of underestimating the one person he had truly thought he could control. "You thought I was gone," I said finally, my voice steady, cutting through the thick tension like a blade. "You thought you could push me off a cliff and erase me. But I'm here. I'm alive. And now everyone's going to know what you tried to do." I watched him flinch, the first real crack in the mask of confidence he had worn so carefully. I had studied him for weeks, and I knew exactly how to push the right buttons. Fear, panic, control slipping from his hands, and I reveled in the power of it. This was justice, yes, but it was also reclamation. I wasn't just surviving. I was taking back everything he had tried to steal. The confrontation didn't end with screams or violence. It ended with the quiet, suffocating weight of inevitability. I had the evidence. I had the truth. He had no way to deny it. Every piece of proof I had collected over the past week made it clear that he had tried to kill me, and now I held all the cards. I forced him to see it, to face it, and the fear in his eyes was intoxicating. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted entirely. He was no longer in control, and I was no longer afraid. Over the next several days, I ensured the evidence was documented, secure, and shared with authorities in a controlled way. I kept moving, staying cautious, avoiding direct confrontation until everything was ready. Every time I thought about the fall, about the moment he shoved me, I felt a mixture of rage and clarity. Rage at what he had tried to do, and clarity in knowing that I had survived, that I had turned the tables completely. He had thought he could end me in an instant, but I had turned survival into a weapon, into leverage, into proof. I had reclaimed my life in the most intense, deliberate way possible. When the authorities finally stepped in, it was both surreal and satisfying. The man who had tried to kill me was taken into custody, forced to confront the evidence and the reality of what he had done. And I watched, standing strong, bruised but alive, as the truth finally caught up with him. I felt a strange mix of relief, anger, and vindication. The months of fear, planning, and sleepless nights had culminated in this moment. I was alive, I had survived, and justice, in its own measured, controlled way, had been served. After everything, I finally allowed myself to breathe. I stayed at a friend's house for a while, trying to process the trauma, the betrayal, and the surreal journey that had begun with that push off the mountain. Each scar, each memory, each tiny detail of the fall reminded me of how close I had come to death, but also how strong I had become. I had faced the man who had tried to erase me from existence and survived. I had faced my fear, my rage, and the uncertainty, and emerged on the other side.
And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel something like peace. Even now, months later, I remember every detail of that day, every second of the fall, every moment of planning and fear that followed. I remember standing at the edge of that cliff, the wind in my hair, the world rushing toward me, and thinking I was about to die. And I remember crawling out of the bushes, surviving, planning, and ultimately reclaiming my life from the man who had tried to take it. The scars are still there, hidden under layers of clothing and carefully controlled appearances, but they remind me of what I endured and what I became because of it. I survived, I fought, I reclaimed my life, and nothing, not even him, can ever take that away from me. The morning after he was taken away, I stood on the edge of the same cliff where he had pushed me, the wind whipping my hair into my face, and I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for a long time: control. My hands rested on the rough rock, and I looked down at the jagged slope below, remembering the fall, the terror, the disbelief. For a moment, the memories threatened to overwhelm me, to pull me back into that raw panic, but I pushed them aside, letting the wind clear my mind, letting the sun cut through the fog of trauma that had clung to me since that day. I had survived. Against every expectation, against every ounce of cruelty, I had survived. I think back to the days immediately after I crawled away from the cliff, bruised, broken, and terrified. Those days were a haze of pain, both physical and mental, of hiding, scavenging, and planning. Every small step I took towards civilization was a victory, a defiance of the fate he had tried to force on me. I stayed in motels under fake names, ate quietly, avoided anyone who might see me, and all the while my mind raced with a singular purpose. I had to survive, and I had to expose him for what he was. Each night I'd replay the fall in my mind, analyzing every movement, every decision he had made, and every mistake he had left for me to exploit. The first time I felt real anger was at the cafe when I overheard those two men talking about him. At first, I froze, not wanting them to recognize me, not wanting them to alert him. But as I listened, hearing his pattern, his past manipulations, his calculated cruelty, I felt a surge of power. I was seeing him clearly for the first time, not as my husband, not as the man I had once trusted, but as a predator. And seeing him stripped of his charm, reduced to his true nature, fueled a fire inside me I hadn't realized I had. It was rage tempered by clarity, and it became the engine that propelled me forward. I spent the following days gathering information relentlessly. I tracked his routines, his contacts, the small details that made him predictable. I documented everything, collected proof of his past threats, his manipulations, and his calculated attempts to erase me. Every time I found a detail, my pulse would quicken, my resolve growing stronger. I felt like a shadow walking through a world that had become mine to navigate cautiously, deliberately. Every step I took was a step toward reclaiming my life, toward confronting the man who had nearly ended it. Breaking into his apartment the night he was at the dinner party was the turning point. The adrenaline, the fear, the calculated risk, I remember every detail of it. Moving through the space that had once been our home, now a trap waiting to be disarmed, I felt an almost surreal combination of dread and focus. Every drawer I opened, every document I read, every piece of evidence I gathered felt like I was peeling back layers of his lies, exposing the truth of the man behind the mask. By the time I left, the folder in my hands contained everything I needed to ensure he could not manipulate or escape accountability. When I finally confronted him, the shift in the air was almost palpable. He saw me, alive, bruised but composed, and for the first time, the carefully constructed facade he had worn for years faltered. He froze, eyes wide with disbelief, as he processed what he was seeing. I didn't shout, I didn't yell, I let my presence speak. I placed the folder on the coffee table and let him see the evidence. Every email, every threat, every calculated act of manipulation laid bare. The shock, the fear, the realization that he had underestimated me completely, watching it all unfold, was almost intoxicating. The confrontation was not violent, but it was intense. I could feel his mind racing, trying to regain control, trying to manipulate, trying to charm his way out. But he couldn't. I had planned for this, anticipated his every move, and I was ready. I calmly explained what he had done, what evidence existed, and how everything pointed directly back to him. I could see the panic flicker in his eyes, the first real fear he had experienced in years. For the first time, he realized he wasn't untouchable, and I realized that I wasn't powerless anymore. I had survived, and now I had the authority to confront him, to control the narrative, to ensure that justice finally would be served. Once the authorities became involved, everything moved swiftly. I stayed vigilant, ensuring that all evidence was secured and shared in a way that left no room for manipulation. He was forced to confront the reality of what he had done, and the documents I had gathered left him with no defense. Seeing him escorted away, finally exposed and held accountable, brought a strange mix of relief, triumph, and a lingering ache. Relief that I had survived, triumph that I had reclaimed my life, and an ache for the betrayal, the violence, and the terror I had endured. Even months later, I revisit that cliff in my mind. I think about how easily it could have ended, how fragile my existence had been at that moment. But I also think about how strong I became because of it. Every step I took after the fall, every decision, every calculated risk, every moment of fear and planning led me here. I had survived what was meant to destroy me, and I had turned it into a weapon, into evidence, into control. I had faced death, betrayal, and manipulation, and I had emerged unbroken. Standing on the cliff now, I feel a strange serenity. The wind cuts against my face, sharp and real, and the world stretches below me in its vast and different beauty. I touch the edge, tracing the stone, and I feel the memory of that push, the violence, the betrayal, but I also feel the power of survival. I survived. I planned. I executed. I reclaimed my life. And I know, beyond any doubt, that nothing he can ever do will take that from me. I've rebuilt my life, slowly, cautiously. Every decision I make now carries the weight of survival. Every interaction is measured. And yet I am learning to trust again, to feel again, to live beyond the trauma. The scars remain, both physical and emotional, and they remind me of what I endured, what I survived, and what I became. But those scars are also proof of strength, proof of resilience, proof that I am unbreakable. I have turned fear into clarity, betrayal into strategy, and survival into empowerment. Even today, I carry the folder with me sometimes, not because I need it, but because it is a reminder of the man who tried to erase me, the fall that almost killed me, and the meticulous planning that allowed me to turn the tables completely. I know now that life can change in an instant, that the people you trust can betray you, and that survival is not just about luck. It's about clarity, planning, and the courage to act when the moment comes. The first night after the confrontation, when the adrenaline faded and the quiet returned, I finally allowed myself to cry. I cried for the fear, the betrayal, the terror, and the weeks of uncertainty that had nearly consumed me. But I also cried for survival, for triumph, for the fact that I had outlived someone who had tried to end me, that I had reclaimed my life on my own terms. It was a long, cathartic release, and for the first time since the fall, I felt a fragile sense of peace. Months have passed since then. Life is quieter, but I am vigilant. I rebuilt my home, surrounded myself with trusted friends, and made sure every aspect of my life was secure. But the memory of the cliff, of the push, of the terror and betrayal remains vivid. It is a part of me now, inseparable from the person I have become. I am stronger, sharper, and more aware of the fragility of trust, the danger of deceit, and the power of survival. I carry it with me, not as a burden, but as a reminder that I survived when I was meant to be destroyed. I often think about him, the man who tried to end me, the man who underestimated me, the man who believed he could erase me from existence.
I think about how carefully I tracked him, how meticulously I prepared, and how, in the end, the truth caught up with him. I think about the fear in his eyes, the moment he realized he had miscalculated, and I feel a quiet, satisfied calm. He thought he controlled the narrative, but I reclaimed it. He thought he could erase me, but I outlived him. And in that there is power, clarity, and a final, unshakable victory. I stand on the cliff now, the wind in my face, the world spread out below me, and I remember every second. I remember the fall, the terror, the uncertainty, the calculated moves, the confrontation, and the final reclaiming of my life. I survived the unimaginable, faced the betrayal of the person I trusted most, and emerged stronger, wiser, and unbroken. And in that survival, in that reclamation of my life, I have found something unexpected. Not just relief, not just triumph, but a sense of clarity and strength that no one can ever take from me.